Hello everyone, welcome to today's Friday lecture, Stories that Make History, Mexico through Elena Poniatowska's Crónicas, with Professor Lynn Steven. I'm Alberto Diaz-Calleros, Director of the Center for Latin American Studies. For those of you who are joining us to our YouTube channel, please do keep note that it is being live streamed, but it will still be available to the public in our class YouTube page. And also, please submit any questions you may have in the YouTube chat so that I can then make sure that we can get those questions answered in the Q&A session. For those of us who are here at Stanford, I want to remind all of us that we're in the land and the territory of the Ohlone original peoples. We offer gratitude to the land, the water, and to the air that surround us. And we want to pay our respects to the past, the present, the future of the Ohlone and the Lenape peoples, who continue to be present in these, their homelands, and throughout their diasporas. For those in the University of Oregon, I want to acknowledge that the university is located in the Kalapuya-Ilihi, the traditional indigenous homeland of the Kalapuya people. Today, descendants are citizens of the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde Community of Oregon and the Confederated Tribes of Siletz Indians of Oregon, and continue to make important contributions to their communities, the university, and across the land that we now refer to as Oregon. It is really a pleasure for me to have Lynn Steven with us today. She's a dear friend. It's a rare pleasure to be able to have a speaker or someone whose work you admire talking about the work that you grew up with and you so deeply admire too. So it is really, a very special thing for me to be here today. I've been learning from Lynn's work even before I had met her, reading about her work in Teotitlán del Valle in Mexico. But she is the Philip Knight Chair and Distinguished Professor of Arts and Sciences. She's also Professor of Anthropology, and she's also a member of the Indigenous Race and Ethnic Studies, the Latinx Studies, the Latin American Studies, and the Women and Genders and Sexuality Studies at the University of Oregon. So you can imagine the broad range of things that she does. She founded also the Center for Latin American Studies at the University of Oregon. She was the director of that center for 9 years. She was also the president of the Latin American Studies Association, which basically tells you how prominent she is within our Latin American community. I won't go into detail on her various books and articles, but she has published widely on topics having to do with transborder communities, gender violence, indigenous social movements, asylum cases in the US. But today she's really going to talk about a project that she has been doing for already some years. She spent a little bit of time also here as our Latin American Perspectives lecturer working on this. So Lynn, thank you so much for being here with us.
Thank you, Alberto. It's a real pleasure to be here today. Thank you all for coming. Outside of a conference I went to in the fall, this is my first live talk about this book. So I've done a lot of Zoom talks, but I'm really excited to have an audience. That rocks. It just makes such a difference, feeling the energy, and especially to have students. Thank you all for coming. Again, I want to thank Alberto for the invitation, for Elizabeth Saenz, and Megan Bonilla for logistics, Sara for making everything function. And just say how fun and great it is to be back here. In 2019, I was here when I was writing this manuscript and did a talk, got some great feedback, but it's very satisfying to be here again to talk about the book. And I hope you all know that it's available open access for free. So if you go to the Duke University website, type in Stories That Make History, you go down to the bottom and it says, I think it says Library Open Access Version. So you can just download it and read it. All right, so my talk is titled Stories That Make History. This is just, I'm going to come back to this. This is the table of contents of the book. So what I'm going to do today is talk about some of the punchlines, the main points of the book. I'm going to talk about how I came to write the book, because I think that's really important for grad students to hear. How long it took, like 11 years. And then I'm going to give us a brief tour of the different chapters in the book. I can't go into great detail because of time, and I'm really hoping to have a conversation for at least 20 or 25 minutes of our hour together. Historical moments when the status quo is cracked open, when people take to the streets and demand change, when another future seems possible, these are the moments. These are the moments when gifted writers and artists step up. The ways that pandemics, massacres, earthquakes, and broad social movements for change are represented and documented can help determine their place in history. I suggest that Elena Poniatowska is one such writer who chronicles Mexican history starting about 1968. In the book, I talk about the Crónica as centered in emotional connections forged through writing about politics. The central concept of the book is strategic, emotional, political community. Crónicas sit at the intersection of fiction and nonfiction. Poniatowska forged direct emotional connections between the oral histories of the stories she tells, the oral testimonies, and readers. Channeling her ability to create complex and rich characters from her novels, of which she has written many, Poniatowska uses the same techniques to communicate the full humanity of those whose stories she shares, and she links them to larger political and economic social relations and structures. And this is really a project that I share as an anthropologist, as an ethnographer. Stories and connecting them to larger structures and putting them out in ways that are accessible. And I wrote this book for a broad English-speaking public, particularly in the US. And I've been amazed over the past several decades that I've been speaking and teaching, working with students, at how few people in the US know about Poniatowska's amazing work, let alone really contemporary Mexican history. So it was really with that sort of general audience, and I wrote it for a broad public. I did not write it for specialists in Mexico City history in the 20th century. It really was to communicate much more broadly. I'm interested in how testimony forges emotional connections. How do people giving public testimony on repression and traumatic events and those listening become emotionally connected to one another? Can they, through this connection, act together to denounce, document, and engage in obtaining social justice, racial justice? Are they part of emotional communities tying speakers, listeners, and readers to difficult and strategic events? Part of my ideas come from the concept of emotional community proposed by Colombian anthropologist Miriam Jimeno as a way of positing how people can become connected through traumatic events. I'm interested in particular in how oral narrative in Crónicas and public performances by writers can bring listeners and readers into community with those whose stories are told. Beyond that, I'm interested in the ways that these connections can influence politics. The transfer of oral testimonies that are written, textualized, and shared widely can play an important role in whose voices are heard and by whom. Testimonies widely disseminated can influence the way that historical events are remembered and even canonized. Stories that make history suggest that the ways that people's stories link to pandemics, massacres, earthquakes, and broad social movements, the way that these are represented and documented can determine their place in history. Compelling forms of writing and other forms of expression and performance are also central, I suggest, to political life. Now, the idea of emotional strategic political community involves not strategic essentialism, but strategies of representation that become tools for influencing change. Emotion channeled through in-depth testimonies and stories on the page and in person creates connection between people that may be intense or muted, that endures or fades, or is rekindled with time. Emotional connection is forged on the ground and can result in the creation of emotional and political community in the moment. The strategic writing involved in documenting and representing such connections and communities may also result in the building of an emotional political community among those who read such accounts and through their reproduction and memorialization. Political performances are also strategies that build emotional political community in the moment and through time. Elena Poniatowska was drawn to documenting already existing or evolving strategic emotional political communities, as well as helping foster them through her writing and her political performances. Strategic emotional political community, as used in my book, is a flexible concept with multiple dimensions that include on-the-ground, face-to-face networks and community building, the representation of such communities in texts, and finally, the possibility of communities of readers. Strategic emotional political communities are not fixed and necessarily stable through time. People can move in and move out of them. They can ebb and flow. At a larger level, writers such as Poniatowska and others actively work to create, preserve, and expand what we might call a strategic emotional political community of the left in Mexico that was a guiding light for oppositional politics for decades. This has been an important contribution to supporting a broad critical public and processes of democratization in Mexico. Through straddling the line between activism and journalism, writing and action, Poniatowska has been an important public intellectual, and I would also suggest political figure in modern Mexico. Okay, before I give you kind of the tour, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how I came to write this book. It's a book that sort of defies genres. Most of my books have been ethnographies. It's not literary analysis. It's not a biography. It's not an ethnography. It's in between genres. It's very interdisciplinary, very perfect for Latin American studies. I first met Elena Poniatowska at my own university in May of 2010. I remember it was pretty close before her birthday. And she came to give the Bartolomé de las Casas lecture, which is a lecture that our Latin American Studies program and our center have. And I remember I took her to a couple of used bookstores in Eugene. She loves books and she wanted to go to bookstores, and she came to my house for tea. And she told me, you're coming to Mexico City, give me a call and we'll have lunch. So I had been invited to teach a course at UNAM, the Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México, in September of 2010 on, I think it was indigenous migration was the topic. So I was set up for like 10 days of going every day and teaching this class. I think it was to grad students through anthropology. So I called her. She invited me to lunch. We had a great time. She invited me to lunch again. I don't remember if it was 3 or 4 lunches. So I was I was teaching this class for like 4 hours, and then we go home, go to lunch, come back, and then get my class ready for the next day. And while I was there, I think I was on a treadmill or something, sort of mulling over these conversations. I thought this would be a really interesting person to write a book about. So I kind of proposed to her doing kind of a testimony of her. And she said, well, yeah, we can talk about that, but I'm agreeable. You can come back and you can interview me. So in August of 2011, I went back and I spent about a week interviewing her. And I learned a lot. It's very difficult to interview someone who's interviewed thousands of people. kind of like Oprah in the US, right? And she's very self-confident. And in the process of those days, we had this very interesting dynamic where, I've interviewed probably thousands of people in my work as an anthropologist, and I was being, kind of polite, treading lightly, and asking, kind of going chronologically in her life. And at one point she fell asleep. And she said, "This is so boring." I said, "Okay, all right, I appreciate that. Let's change the dynamic." So I sort of stopped being polite and really started, pitching some harder questions. She pitched hard questions back at me, and it really turned into kind of a dialogue where we were really kind of interviewing each other. And that was fascinating. And then I went back with all of this material and decided really that what my contribution could be is not like telling the story of Elena Poniatowska. There already were biographies and many articles, but really looking at the impact that she had had on Mexican politics and Mexican history. So I proposed to her, thinking about her as a political figure. She said, "Well, I've never thought of myself as a political figure. I'm a writer." But that was kind of what we settled on. So I continued going to Mexico City and interviewing her, hanging out with her a couple times a year for really another 8 or 9 years. I met all her grandchildren. I accompanied her in public. I interviewed people who were close to her. And then I had some other places that were also really important, like in writing a book, it's important to get time off. So in 2016, I had a fellowship at the University of Oregon Humanities Center, and I had a sabbatical in 2018 and 2019. That was really fundamental. I was in residence as a fellow at the Center for U.S. Mexican Studies. I came here as a Latin American Perspective Scholar, and I got a lot of critical feedback from historians, and I really have to thank historians in this book in significant ways. First of all, they provided really good reviews with very concrete things, but they were also able to think much more in an interdisciplinary way. I think I had to keep saying, "Please don't send this to someone who does literary criticism," because I'm not a literary critic. That's not the reading that I'm going to give. And I also, at the suggestion of my editor at Duke, decided to work with, for the first time in any of the many books I've written, to work with an editor to sort of rewrite for a more general audience, because that was my goal. This was not going to be a book, like I said, that is going to intervene in the, in the historiography of Mexico or Mexico City in a very, I could have done that, but that was really not my project. So writing for a broad audience. And that I learned so much from that process about writing, and plus this book is about writing and the influence of writing. So it really made me think. And now I'm actually teaching writing workshops to our own graduate students, going through this process influenced me as a teacher. And finally, fortunately, I was able to visit the Fundación Poniatowska that has an amazing archive, and it closed, and I think it's still closed because of the pandemic. And I was able to view a lot of photographs and then get permission to use some in the book. But being able to even look at hundreds of photographs was also really great, because that's another, source of information. Okay, so who is Elena Poniatowska? Well, she's a journalist, she's a publisher, she's an author of many different forms of writing, of novels, of short stories, of thousands of newspaper articles. She still is writing for La Jornada, Crónicas. She's written children's stories. She's a political activist, and these are words that she used to describe herself. She's also a mother and a grandmother. Elena Poniatowska Amor is the daughter of a French father of Polish origin, Jean E. Poniatowski, and you can learn something about language, because if you're female, it's Poniatowska, and if you're male, it's Poniatowski. and a Mexican mother, Paula Amor. She was born in Paris in 1932 and moved to Mexico at the age of 18. Elena was educated in a French school in Mexico City. She spent time in the United States at a Catholic girls' school where she learned a lot about writing. And she had hoped to actually stay in the US and study medicine, but apparently the peso dropped and her parents were not able to keep her in the US. And she turned to Mexico and she learned how to type and she learned shorthand, very specific method, like how to write on a pad and take shorthand. And she began her career in 1953 working as a reporter for the society column of the Excelsior paper. And she's been writing ever since. She later wrote for Novedades, but at that point in time, women were not reporters. They were pretty much confined to writing about, famous people or artists or the latest, gossip of the elites. So that was where she started. Okay, so this is just an outline of the book, and I'll talk through the chapters a little bit. The first chapter is really where I had to dig into history that I did not know in looking at Mexico City's growing critical public and looking at the history of news and of publishing. Then the book looks at the 1968 movement and massacre. It moves to the 1985 earthquake, civil society, and a new political future. Then it looks at the Zapatista movement and her engagement with the Zapatista movement. Amanecer en el Zócalo is one of her books that very few people have read. It has not been translated into English, which is about the 2006 occupation of the Zócalo by AMLO. I was in Oaxaca in a different occupation at the same time. And the last chapter is about the disappearance of students from Ayotzinapa. So I want to just talk briefly about each of these parts. So one of the big questions that I had to answer in this book is like, how did it come to be that Elena Poniatowska wrote these things, that people read them and it had influence, right? We can't just assume, because something is published that it has an impact. So I really began to look at sort of the history of news and, particularly left publishing. And there's been a great deal of work by many historians on sort of the history of news, of newspapers in Mexico in the past 15 years. And I really benefited from that. And there's kind of this idea, that the PRI controlled the press and that there was no opposition and that, it wasn't really till the 70s or the 80s that things started to open up. And that's actually not the case. And because of this careful historical work, we can see, for example, in cultural supplements of mainline newspapers run by people like Fernando Benitez, that there was a lot of engagement with, more radical topics, sometimes wrapped in culture, sometimes not. The publications of the UNAM, that's where Monsiváis started writing. The work of Pablo Picato about notas rojas and sort of crime tabloids and the way that people express themselves in the letters to the editors and, spoke out against the police, against government, much, much earlier. And also small radical presses like Porque, that's up there, that really was one of the few newspapers that covered the massacre of students in 1968, like on its front page, with those very upsetting pictures. So I think it was really important to get this more nuanced sort of picture of a critical public and where that comes from and the complexity of that, and the many different kinds of newspapers, many different kinds of readers, and that even in a mainline newspaper, there may be different readers, for different sections. And that people were reading, people who were clases populares were reading notas rojas and participating in them. And in terms of publishing, looking at, the chapter sort of documents the histories of a number more radical presses, but also really beginning with Siglo XXI, beginning with Fondo de la Cultura Económica, where you had the person, Orfila, who published there, going on and leaving the Fondo, for example, after scandals about books that were published by the Fondo, and founding other more radical presses. And Elena was involved in founding a number of those presses as well. So that's just to give some kind of a context about what the venues are, who the readers are, to try to understand how do you develop this critical public. You don't just assert that it's there. The second chapter looks at probably her most well-known and widest read book, La Noche de Tlatelolco, the student movement, and the pictures also are very, very important in that book and the way that it works. It's almost like a film when you look at these pictures and you read these descriptions. And it documents the student movement and the massacre. And one of the most interesting things for me in doing this project was I kept running into so many people, mostly in Mexico, who had read this book. Their parents had read the book, or some cousin had given it to them, or they had read it in school as a part of the school curriculum, in middle school or high school. Seems particularly in Catholic schools, but some public schools as well. So I decided to do a survey of readers, not scientific, not a snowball survey of different generations of people in Mexico about her, what they had read, and where they read it. And it was just fascinating, in different parts from Monterrey to Oaxaca to Chiapas to Mexico City to Baja, how many people, had read this. And that's when I really started to think about readers and communities of readers. And then I also thought about this every time I accompanied her in public, like in book fairs, and there would just be all these people not, wanting her to sign their book of hers that she was reading, and she would interact with each one, and these were not elite folks. These were, again, working class people, different kinds of folks, indigenous folks, who had engaged with these books. And I thought there is really something going on there. So that was an interesting, piece of that chapter. The third chapter, the 1985 earthquake, civil society, and a new political future. And I neglected to add that a number of these events that this book and her work documents, I also participated in or was present for. I was living in Mexico in 1985, so I wasn't there for the first quake, but the second one, and spent about a month working to support people in the quake, and it made a big impression on me. So part of, obviously, the logic of why these particular events also relates to my own experience. And this was a chapter where I tried to not only comment on her book, but when I was doing this research, there was a lot of 30th anniversary of the earthquake memorialization going on, and I went to these pláticas and el Museo de la Ciudad and other places where she would talk. And at one of these pláticas, this guy stood up and said, he thanked her so much. She had interviewed his brother who had died in the earthquake. And he had gone to her house in Chimalstac and she had interviewed him. And he goes, and here's the interview. And then he handed her this USB and said, I wrote my own testimonio, right? So it's like this very generative space that also kind of made visible to me the impact over time of multiple generations of her book, of her interviews. There was a whole exhibit in, I think it was Museo de la Ciudad, that had quotes from her and all these pictures. That's a picture with a quote from Monsiváis. So I went to these exhibits and I sort of listened to people, kind of walk through and talk about the earthquake. And They were all like, how could this have happened? How could people not have paid attention? From junior high school age kids to older adults. So there was a lot of opportunity to sort of look at performance, exhibits, and other ways that this book, this document of the book and what it represented was sort of being recreated and remembered and sort of amplified in these ways. And the other thing the chapter does is, when I was writing it, I found Miguel de la Madrid's book, which is called Cambio de Rumbo, Testimonio de un Presidente. So he's writing like his own testimony. And I began reading his testimonio against Elena's book, Nada Nadie. And these two figures, Elena Corona, who was an activist for the Sindicato de Costureras, 19 de diciembre, and Cuauhtémoc Abarca, who started the Coordinadora de Residentes de Tlatelolco. They were both like big presence in her book, but Miguel de la Madrid was really obsessed with them and trying to like discredit them. So it was very interesting to read these two accounts together. And she also does this sort of contrasting strategy in her book where she highlights, for example, a father who came to the baseball park, Parque de la Seguridad, where all the bodies were piled, and he was looking for a casket for his daughter, like the right size, and she describes this search, and it's beautiful, but just so sad. And then the next thing you read is about an official government meeting with all these elites and political people at the Anthropology Museum for the Comisión de la Reconstrucción, right? And it's just so starkly different. So that was that chapter. The following chapter is about her engagement with the EZLN. And I spent about 10 years working in Chiapas. Myself, I wrote a book called Zapata Lives about the Zapatista movement and its impact in Oaxaca. And I spent a lot of time with Zapatistas also, and in some of these same spaces that she writes about. And she began exchanging letters with Marcos. Marcos invited her to come to one of the first big gatherings, the Convención Nacional Democrático, that happened in 1994. I went to that also. And she publishes this first series of interviews with Marcos and other Zapatistas, and she took her children there. And she was there for, I think she made 2 trips. And her daughter, Paula, was there for about a month. They brought all these books from Mexico City for a library, and Marcos had let Elena know that La Noche de Tlatelolco was in his library, there in Guadalupe, Tepeyac. And I think, for everyone who went to that convention, and it was very amazing and transforming. It's one of the most incredible experiences I've had in my life. And she really engaged with Zapatista women. And I think, so this is a chapter that has a strong sort of theme in relation to gender. And she, if you look at her writing and her public speeches, she's constantly lifting up Zapatista women and their ideas that you can have indigenous autonomy and you can also have, sort of women's rights of different kinds at the same time. It's not like a choice, like one or the other. And Comandante Ramona, who was a very well-known comandante, stayed at Elena's house for about a week before she had kidney surgery. And Elena got to know her a little bit. And she also engaged with other Zapatista women, but this is where it's really clear she used all of her platforms, to put forward Zapatista bands in Mexico City, when one of the Zapatista women for the first time spoke to the Mexican Congress, and there was, just many events. Elena was there. And one of the things I wanted to try to figure out, and this is probably why it's one of the wonkiest chapters, was how she was connecting with these women. Like, how was that happening? Because her life was so different, you know, from Zapatista women in Chiapas and the communities that I had spent time in. And I began to, you know, think about it and look at some of these conversations. Marcos did some back and forth with people like Marta Lamas about abortion, and the positioning of, you know, the Catholic Church and the Zapatistas. And Elena was also writing at the same time, kind of about abortion politics. This was not easy for her. And then part of our conversation that I was never going to publish, she made public not very long before the book was published through her novel, El Amante Polaco. And essentially there she tells the story of an assault by a writer, and this is in fact the story of how her first son was born. That was very difficult for her. She was a single mother with a child in elite society in Mexico, and she was really shunned and punished for a very long time. So I think that experience kind of also influenced her interest and maybe ability to connect with women, you know, who were disempowered in very different kinds of circumstances. And she really, I think, as a result, tries to, you know, sort of raise up Indigenous women and Indigenous feminisms when she, you know, in numerous occasions, she has, you know, cited Zapatista women. Okay. The following chapter, Amanecer en el Zócalo, is based on this book. The occupation was in 2006. It was a 50-day occupation that AMLO, this was his first try at the presidency, the current president of Mexico, he made it third time, occupied, and it was a huge, huge occupation that really made a huge mess out of Mexico. Many people were very upset about it. Like I said, I was in Oaxaca. I think it actually allowed the Oaxaca social movement to get much further than it would have because everyone was focused on Mexico City. And Elena participates in this, and it's an interesting book because it's both a diary of what's going on, but it's also a crónica. So it's really kind of a hybrid form for her. And she documents, like she always does, like all of the people that keep the planton going, like the women who are cooking the food, the people who are carrying water, her friend Jesus Rodriguez, who was directing the stage, who like also directed the stage in Chiapas, and what it's like to camp there. And then she's documenting also like politicians who come in and then they leave, right? They come and go, they don't stay, but all the people who are kind of there. And she also documents, this is the one time she got formally involved in a political campaign. She documents sort of going on the road for AMLO in 2006 as the cultural ambassador, and documents like encounters with Indigenous women in Quintana Roo and how amazing these young women were and what great ideas they had. And what I found most interesting about this book and conversations with her about it was the way she really pointed out sort of the limits and challenges of the formal political system and the way that they interfaced with social movements. And she really raises some questions about the sort of style of politics that emerged out of this gathering, which is sort of a mass meeting where you read a referendum and then everyone says yes or no, and that's it. And in the process of participating in this planton and in what was, I guess, AMLO's Convención Nacional Democrático, she received a letter from Cuauhtémoc Cárdenas, who was someone that she knew, and she took this letter really seriously. And she, you know, he was basically saying, this is not the path. Let's have a political path. Let's not have this kind of mass meeting. Why now? And she tried to bring this letter, you know, to Jesus Rodriguez. She tried to bring it to AMLO, and they just dismissed her. Mm. And when she gave a speech at this convention and she mentioned this letter and read it, she was like massively booed. And then she wrote, you know, some really interesting observations about, is this a discussion? Is this how we have political dialogue? So really kind of questioning the process. And she also received a lot of personal threats against her life, and her family did, when she was engaged in this campaign. So she paid a really, really big price, I think, personally, and in other ways for doing this. But for that reason, I think it's a really interesting book that sort of, in a sense, might foreshadow some of the things we might be seeing now in Mexican politics. The last chapter, Regresenles, the 43 disappeared students from Ayotzinapa. I used a number of sort of analytical devices to try to illustrate not only her as a writer, but as a performer. And she gave this amazing sort of talk that she basically ended up passing out almost in the Zócalo because it was so hot. And it was recognizing sort of one by one these 43 students, reading a description of each one, and then having the crowd say, "Bring them back." And she also, at a lot of ferias del libro in Guadalajara, in Mexico City, she would cede her space to either other students or relatives of the 43 students. I'm sorry, I'm not going into the story of how this happened. I realize not everybody may know that, but we can talk about that. But these were students who commandeered a bus, were going to protest, as traditionally has happened, the anniversary of the massacre of students in 1968, and they were disappeared. There was a big federal investigation, and I just put up, this is the most recent report of the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, which exposes the involvement of high-level government officials and the creation of a cover-up involving the military, and also sort of making up a crime scene. And there still is no official response for this. These families are still waiting. Some of the parents have died. And it's a horrible thing that is ongoing, but also reminds us in the context of Mexico now how many people are disappeared, how many journalists have been killed and targeted for even reporting on disappearances. So lifting up the disappeared of Ayotzinapa in this context today continues to be important because this is just such a challenge, and the number of women who are murdered. There was just a New York Times story, I think, about this a couple days ago. So this is another way, that Elena, as a writer, sort of used her platform, her public performances to move these issues forward. So I'll just leave it as a question, like the future of the Crónica. About 6 weeks ago, I had the great pleasure of having a book talk with Juan Villoro, which was really fun. This is a great book, El Vértigo Horizontal. If you love Mexico City, it's in English, Horizontal Vertical. It's a must-read. And I also just finished this book called The Invisible Child, which I would argue is also a Crónica by Andrea Elliott, Pulitzer Prize winning, which documents the story of one girl and her family in New York, sort of trapped in poverty and all of the U.S. bureaucratic institutions that she has to go through. It's a very compelling book. So I'll stop there, and hopefully we can have a conversation.
Thank you, Lynn. So I will probably start by fielding questions from the room. Yeah, Sean, go ahead.
One of the things that really impressed me in the beginning was the attention you give to making your work accessible, both financially and in terms of the way you phrase things. Could you talk about the difficulties that you faced in making it accessible, and also why it was so important to you?
Well, I guess I have to position myself first to answer your question honestly, because I'm a tenured professor with a an endowed chair, right? So I have a great job, I have a really good salary, and I am incredibly privileged. Okay, so let's just start right there. Because for most, like I teach ethnography to grad students, I teach collaborative ethnography, I teach about writing. And if you're inside an academic institution and you want to get your master's degree here, you want to get your PhD and write your dissertation, unfortunately, still, not everywhere, there are real limits in the style that you can write in the literature that you have to cite. Really, there's kind of a formula, a writing formula, for the kind of narrative that you can construct, the kind of language, the kind of justification, the people you need to cite. So I went through that, but I always like to acknowledge that, you know, you don't have a lot of control over how you write and the form that you write when you're a grad student. I have always done other kinds of work to make my research accessible. All of my projects except my dissertation have been collaborative with communities, with organizations. So I have published in Spanish a number of my books. It's increasingly hard to do that. I've been involved in comic books, believe it, you know, like what we now call graphic novels, small graphic novels. That sounds much more elegant, in putting out the results of research. I've been involved in making films, documentary films, and in creating websites that have, my last book, We Are the Face of Oaxaca, has kind of an archive attached to it that has a website. It has a lot of photographs. It has 26 videos that are, have English subtitles to make that accessible. I've been involved in a project with 12 community organizations and some other organizers where we put out reports and we lobby the legislature, and I'm writing academic articles on the side. So, and I also try to write op-eds sometimes. So it's always been important to me to write accessibly. One of the earlier projects I did was to edit a testimony with Maria Teresa Tula, who is one of the founders of the Comadres of El Salvador. And that was a really important book. It was published in Spanish, it was published in English, and it was her story. She's the author, but kind of, recording, transcribing, going back and forth with her, that whole process. And how many people read that? More people read that than some of the academic books I published that got me tenure and promotion, but had, sort of convinced me. So in this case, I told you my motivation for writing the book. And when I got the reviews back, the first set of reviews, when you write a manuscript, I had a contract for the book with Duke. I think this is either my fourth book with Duke. I can't remember. But, you're obligated. But so you turn in a manuscript and you send it out for reviews. And the reviews came back, and, it was clear that there was kind of a fork in the road. Either I was going to, really move into like Mexico City history and the press and kind of all of this, or I was going to have to, rewrite or rethink where I was aiming this book at. So I decided to do that. I wanted the book to be open access because I wanted students to be able to read it, and so Duke has this option. A lot of presses do, but it was originally, I was telling Alberto, $15,000. I was like, whoa. So I kind of negotiated with them, and I was able to, through time, get my university to make a donation, and also from my research funds. But again, I'm privileged because I have those research funds to draw on. I have an endowment with my endowed chair. So we got it down to $10,000 and they made it open access. And that, I don't know if that answers your question. It was a long-winded answer, I apologize.
Thank you.
Yes.
Yeah, I had a question. I wanted to ask you, what were some of the challenges in sort of synthesizing your work? Because I think in your own words you said that you weren't trying to make this into biography, but obviously with someone so influential like Elena, covering some of the most important events in 20th century Mexico, I would assume it would have been really difficult to sort of again, sort of compile this in the narrative that you're trying to write it in?
Right. Well, I believe a lot in story. I mean, I actually, have projects that have questionnaires and statistics, but I have this basic belief in the power of story for humans. I'm an anthropologist. So if you look through time, most of the information and the knowledge that we have is transmitted orally. And that still is the case in a lot of parts of the world, right? Where people learn from radio, they learn from other forms. So having a central story, I think, is really important. So in this case, she is kind of the glue for the book. I mean, it focuses on her and her writing, but because she wrote so much about so many different things, it allowed me to sort of have this larger story of contemporary Mexican history sort of through her and her work, and tell enough about her, so it's not a biography. It offers sort of different shifting points in her life, but also it's about writing and the power of writing. So having a writer, as one of the central figures, also that allowed me to connect up with this idea of strategic, emotional, political communities, right? As kind of a analytical device to pull the book together, and to look at the influence of reading and reaching people through reading. That sort of also cuts across the book. So I know it was an unusual book, and it took me a while to kind of figure out what was this central analytical thread that was going to go through the book, the concept, and not have it just be a story about her and her writing, but to make a larger point about writing, performance, memory, and documentation, and how that really can impact history. And I think it was interesting. I was writing the final version of the book in the pandemic. And it was such an interesting moment because we were so fragmented. We weren't in rooms like this connected. We're like on these little squares in Zoom. And I just thought how important it was going to be for documenting the pandemic and the impact that it had. And I feel like we still don't have enough, so many people have died, but we don't think about that. So it kind of redoubled my idea about the importance of documentation, and documentation that's like out there in the world and consumed, and how that affects history, but also sort of memory, the way we remember history. And I think in talking to people who read her work when they were young, especially about 1968, they would say, I had no idea. I had this like official story about what happened. And then my cousin gave me this book, and it changed me as a person. It like changed how I view my country. It changed how I view myself as a citizen in that country. And those statements were really powerful to me too. Thank you for your question.
I don't want to take up time from students, but thank you very much for the talk. I have a question having to do with ethnography.
Yes.
I'm a literary critic, but I won't go there.
Okay.
I'm
not.
and let me preface this with an anecdote. I met Elena Poniatowska in 2004. I was a grad student at the time. And this was in Austin, Texas, for one of these ILASA conferences.
Yes.
So I was with, I think, 3 or 4 other students in a small car. And we go to pick her up at the airport. And so she gets in the car, she's grabbing onto her purse, she's sitting between 2 students right back there. There's an awkward silence. And the first thing she asks is, ¿Y nosotros qué tenemos para ofrecerle a los Estados Unidos? And I'm sure in your interactions that she would have those kind of like quizzing questions, right? Part of the performance. So I guess the question, with that preface is, what do you make as an ethnographer of her ladiness, her ladylike presence? In that picture with Subcomandante Marcos,
right?
I believe she's wearing pearls in chapas, right? In pearls. So that would be one question about her ladylike quality, and then another, if time permits, would have to do with the other side of emotional political communities, which is consumption.
Yeah.
Because she's read, and her books are bought. I mean, They have this quality that it sometimes verges on the soap opera, on the melodrama. They're also read. There's a level of engagement that happens through consumption. So I don't know. Feel free to pass on any of these.
Yeah. No, those are great questions. Thank you. They're all great questions. As I in the book I write about her as a political actor and about performance, right? About political performances. So obviously this is a person who's in the public eye, has been in the public eye, and knows that I have to go back and look at more of those pictures from Chiapas. And she constantly, engages with people. So I'm sure she has like a repertoire of questions or statements, that she engages with. A lot of people, when I've given this book talk, I met quite a number of academics who tried to interview her as grad students or as, professors, and they said it was impossible. I couldn't really get her to engage. She just wanted to talk about her grandchildren or, so I think as a public person, like all public people, she has a series of, ways of engaging or sort of feeling things out or having a conversation. I think as an ethnographer, and this is where I'm very different than a journalist or a political scientist who, talks to somebody once. In my own work, I have engaged with people through long periods of time, the same set of families, the same set of people. So I'm accustomed to kind of developing a relationship with the person through time. And I think that was fundamental here was, over an 11-year period, I visited her a lot. And also, in that initial conversation where I sort of, I was trying to be like super Cortez, and I said, this is not going to work. I'm going to have that same experience that other people are describing, is kind of, okay, I'm going to ask some hard questions and push back. And she kind of took it up. So I think after that experience where I also shared, things about me, my life, my family that I don't make public because that's what happened. It was, it was an exchange. And that often happens as an anthropologist through time where, you're living in a community or you're working with the same set of people. And like Sunday, I was at an event in Eugene. I brought some students. We were filming. It was a land blessing ceremony. And there were people there that I have been working with for like 20 years in Oregon. This young guy came up to me and told me he's getting a PhD from Yale. And I knew him, when he was like in high school as a farm worker. I think that's kind of what I brought to this project. Maybe it's just stubbornness and persistence. But also a willingness to return again and again and again. And that's a big complaint about anthropologists or researchers in general, is they kind of fly in, get their stuff, they leave, and then you don't see them again. So having that like compromiso to come back, to talk, is just a part of the way I've worked for a really long time. So I've had other experiences of interviewing people where I thought, for example, talking to people in the military or people in the Chiapas state government who may have known who I was, and I was really worried they wouldn't talk to me or they would just dismiss me and just say, oh, she's in La Boquilla, I'm not going to talk to her. But being patient and engaging, kind of keeping that up. Okay, so the second, you got to remind me of the second question.
About her books also as
about consumption. Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, one of the things I tried to find out was how many copies of every book, that I was engaging with had been published. And it was easy to find, for things that were in their 9th, 10th, 11th printing. But of course, people buy them like they buy books to consume them. And not everyone is, going to be motivated in this way that I'm talking about in terms of a political community. They're reading the book, to consume. And the creation of characters, the creation of drama, the ability to kind of capture that is obviously related not only to that connection that I'm talking about, but it makes people want to read the story, right? Like a telenovela. And, I asked her, why do people, I asked a lot of people, why do they like Crónicas so much? And her and other people's responses, well, if you can get the right story, it's much better than a novel, right? And it's real. So I think you're right, that, consumerism is part of that, but you can be a consumer at one point and then be thinking about it in a different way afterwards. So I think the way that people politically engage as consumers and readers is complex and it shifts through time. Thank you for the question.
So I'm going to have to stop the Q&A here at this point, but we will have an opportunity to continue a little bit of the conversation here. But formally, we are finishing the broadcast of today's lecture, Stories That Make History, Mexico, through Elena Poniatowska's Crónicas with Lynn Steven. And I want to remind you, next Friday, May 13, actually, 2 Fridays from now, we'll talk about development of diagnostic kits for neglected viral diseases from the bench to the field with our Tinker visiting professor Claudia Núñez Duarte dos Santos. So we move into a very different realm of epidemiology and questions that also concern us all. But thank you so much, Lynn.
Thank you all for being here.
So we can continue on. It's just that we move to